Okay, so I'm back. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. You're watching a video, so I presume for you it's a good thing. It's been about 5 weeks, I think, since I last made a video, which was on the Imperial College paper regarding the coronavirus, which did pretty well, actually, for me, very well, nearly 44,000 views, and I haven't made a video in the intervening period. I think you can probably guess why. Something's been going on in the world, hasn't it? And Julie, this video will be about the coronavirus thing. Somebody said to me yesterday that they kind of thought with all this going on, one of the sort of upsides will be most of their favourite YouTubers will be making more videos, and that hasn't turned out to be the case. I have seen some of the channels that I've followed, they've been making a video, knocking one out sort of every day, and other channels just aren't doing anything. And I think that's just the way that this affects different people. Practically, but also in terms of just knocking people out of their stride, which is something that I want to talk about in this video. And the sort of how disconcerting I think that's been on society, but also on individuals. There are some people perhaps living on their own but working hard who now have the opportunity. They're sat on their arses all day. They may as well knock out another video telling you that they've mown the lawn or whatever they've completed that day. Whereas for other people, I know I'm homeschooling my son. He's home every day where he was going to school, etc., etc. So there are these things which, and it just generally knocks you out of your stride. My wife's home all the time as well, so it's a very different situation. I don't want to go too much into the personal stuff now. I know there are some people who are interested in that, so I'll just talk a little bit about that at the end of the video. I'm not going to talk about it now. There was just some points that I really want to talk about, things that have come up that I've just found interesting, above and beyond some of the usual diatribe maybe that you'll be discussing on YouTube perhaps. But I hope first off, because it has been 5 weeks, I'm okay, by the way. My family's okay. I've got an 80-year-old mother and a 75-year-old father-in-law. They're well isolated, but they're doing okay, other than the fact my mother's broken a foot again, fractured a foot, and she's limping around the house, poor woman. But they're doing okay. I'm doing okay with my wife and little boy. I hope you're all alive and well out there. Well, I mean, obviously you're alive, right? Otherwise you wouldn't be watching it. You could be sort of sat there, I suppose, festering in your chair, which you probably will be by the end of this video anyway, some of you. But I just hope that this finds you all well. So what did I want to talk about? Well, I'd written down a few points that I wanted to talk about. This is a video that I wanted to make for a few days, and it's not going to be the most structured video. But it's a kind of, I suppose, a keep in touch thing, and just a few things that I've sort of enjoyed or thought about, experienced, and it's just cropped up. And the first one, I suppose, one of the things that I've just enjoyed has been Donald Trump through all of this. What a batshit crazy twat that guy is. It's the kind of thing that I have to say, once you've elected somebody like that, I want to say you can never unelect them. I don't mean that obviously he can only do 2 terms, but that will always stain you as a nation in a way. And I'm sorry if you're a Donald Trump fan, but why would you be? Whether you're left wing or right wing, why would you be a Donald Trump fan? The guy, he's obviously not a moron because he's got to where he is, but the guy, he just says the most incredible bullshit. The one that he came out with a couple of days, I think he surpassed himself, where he suggested that because disinfectants kill the virus, you put disinfectant on the virus, it kills it, that maybe we should start injecting people with disinfectant.
Supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light, and I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right, and then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me. So we'll see. But the whole concept of the light, the way it kills it in 1 minute, that's pretty powerful.
And this might be some kind of a strategy. I've never ever heard a world leader ever come up with this kind of shite in my entire life. And he does this kind of thing. I mean, that sort of set a new bar, I think. But he does it on a fairly regular basis. I heard a sort of interview with that Anthony Fauci, who's one of his advisors, the little silver-haired guy stands in the background there, and they were kind of asking him, what do you do when the president comes up with all this kind of stuff? And he's saying, well, I can't just grab the microphone and say this is wrong, so I have to sort of wait for my turn and then just sort of rephrase what the president said in different language, effectively to make it sound like it isn't a load of absolute shite. I mean, it's embarrassing to listen to that. I know I've heard people say in the past, well, yeah, we elected Donald Trump and now you've elected Boris Johnson, but there's no comparison between those two individuals. They might be right-wing and have some similar political opinions, but Boris Johnson may act the fool and may be self-deprecating, but in many ways they're the exact things that Donald Trump thinks he isn't. Boris Johnson plays the fool, Donald Trump is the fool. Boris Johnson is multilingual, he's highly fluent in Latin, he's a student of Greek literature, for crying out loud, and Donald Trump's just a batshit crazy moron in some ways. I'm sorry if somebody doesn't like that, but it's staggering to listen to some of this stuff that he's come out with on a daily basis. And I don't know how anybody who's American cannot be offended, or not offended, embarrassed to listen to that and think, shit, this is what our president's coming out with. Everybody around the world is hearing this shit, right? So even if you agree with his basic economic positions or his social positions, I don't know how you cannot be embarrassed by that. It's like the United Kingdom having David Icke as Prime Minister is effectively the equivalent of what you have there with some of the stuff. Does he not clear this? Does he not say, is this a good idea? Is this a sensible thing to say? Or am I out of my depth saying this? He's got these advisors. Does he not even ask them beforehand? I just don't know. Or does he ask them and they're too scared to say, no, Donald, I'm sorry you're talking crap? I don't know. I just don't know. But that's been a great source of amusement to me. I'm not American, so it doesn't reflect on me. I can just sit back and enjoy all of that. The UK, though, we've had a few things in the UK that there's been lots of things that I could have written all of these down as it went along, and I didn't. But there's just a few things that I wanted to pick up on, of course. One thing that we've seen in England is the police have a difficult job here. They're being asked to police something that is totally out the ordinary and would go against the things that most of our society would normally accept, that we'd find palatable. That's been one of the things interesting across the Western world, really, for societies that are so keen on maintaining their freedoms and being very averse to this sort of authoritarian top-down approach, and now being quite happy for governments to say, you can't go out your house, you can't do this, you can't do that. And that's been kind of interesting, that. But there's certainly been some strands within the police that have been way over the top. I think it was Derbyshire Police Force in the UK quite early on started showing footage of people walking in, I think it was probably the Dales, the Derbyshire Dales, possibly miles away from everywhere else. They'd got a drone filming these people and suggesting this was some sort of terrible thing because they'd driven there. I mean, these are a couple of people walking with a dog, possibly miles away from anywhere else, but they'd sooner have them walking in a town centre somewhere, right? The logic is just baffling. There was another police officer shown berating a guy for allowing his child to play in his garden, which is totally legal, it's totally allowed, it's part of the government's recommendations. Again, very overbearing by the police, totally unnecessary. And what kind of motivation drives that? That's what I don't understand. And then there was another one. I think it may have been the same police force talking about checking your trolleys, that you're only allowed to go out and buy things which are essential. And yet the government advice is, like, a store can open or a store can't open. And if your store is a kind of store that can open, like it's, say, a hardware store, then you're open to be able to sell whatever you would normally sell. It's not like where you can't buy that tin of paint, but you can buy that bag of nails. Then you can buy whatever's in that store. And yet this police officer was suggesting that they'd be walking down the aisles checking people's shopping is essential, which is not their remit to do, which was a total authoritarian overstep. And it does make you wonder. There are obviously some people within police forces that have those kind of authoritarian tendencies, and I think that kind of that type of cream, that manner of cream is risen to the top in some instances here. And I think that's quite unfortunate, because I think that makes the police's job, which is a difficult job with all of this, more difficult. Certainly hasn't been my experience locally, by the way. I think the police force round here has been eminently reasonable. Another example of that was a couple of days ago in Wales. This was not the police force, this was the advice from the Welsh government. I might edit this just to show you the thing. I'll put the item here. What the Welsh government has suggested, the British government, if you're not aware, the British government's advice is to go out there and take exercise. Eminently sensible, I think, much more sensible than in Spain, where it's like nobody can leave their houses to exercise or whatever. No, sensible approach. You can leave, you can exercise, try and keep it to once a day. I think in Wales legally it's criminal if you exercise outside the house more than once a day, but whatever. You can go out to get some fresh air, to exercise, and that's eminently sensible. Not everybody's got a garden. Some people are living in a block of flats. You know, if you've got 3 screaming kids in a block of flats, you're going to be pulling your hair out. You need to be able to go out as a family for a walk, get out the house for a bit. But you would think, not everybody lives in London, 12 million people or whatever. If you live in the middle of London, it's a long way to get outside of it. And not everybody lives in the countryside. I live in a small town, about 15,000 people. It's 100 yards and I'm in the countryside, okay. Not everybody lives in those circumstances. A lot of people in the UK are living in towns, populations 50,000 to 200,000. And in those circumstances, their immediate surroundings, half a mile around them, a couple of miles, is built up areas. Then you start to get into the countryside. The Welsh government's advice is that you shouldn't be cycling. If you're a cyclist, you shouldn't be cycling away from home any further than you could reasonably walk. This was their advice. And I cannot think of a more insane piece of advice. That's like a piece of mean-spirited, mealy-mouthed advice that you would give simply because you want to maintain an authoritarian sort of clamp on someone, rather than giving them sensible advice. It's very much in terms as well as people interpreting the letter of the law rather than the spirit of the law. What are we trying to achieve with this measure? Of course, what we're trying to achieve with this measure is social distancing. Yes, you can go out and exercise once a day, but keep away from everyone. Right. Stay on your own. Keep your distance from everyone. What could be better then? You're in one of these towns which most people live in the United Kingdom, where if you stay within walking distance, that probably means you're cycling round the middle of your town, past everybody. Do 12 laps of the middle of your town, right, along with everybody else in the town who wants to cycle, who are all doing 12 laps in the middle of the fucking town, cycling past one another, cycling past the pedestrians, blowing the snot rockets out your nose, coughing as you're going along, etc., while other people are there. Alternatively, you could just cycle out as cyclists do normally, get yourself out in the countryside and cycle around for an hour and a half, couple of hours, and not see a single soul. Right, how is that the worst thing to do? Why is that the thing that they are trying to dissuade people from doing? It smacks of either mean-spiritedness or cluelessness. I don't know which one it is. But it's another example of just sort of, with this whole business, people setting rules up and then following the rules rather than thinking what those rules are trying to achieve and how best we can implement those rules to achieve that. So that's a bit of a criticism there, I suppose, of England and Wales. And I haven't got one for Northern Ireland, but I've got one for Scotland, which is that I heard Nicola Sturgeon talking. She gave a speech a day ago now, and some of it was quite good in that she was quite frank with the Scottish people and the people of the UK, because the action will be coordinated, whatever happens, I'm sure. And so it was quite refreshing in those regards. But there was an aspect to her speech which sort of got onto what I would call this sort of superhero talk, this kind of nobody will be left behind. Because she got into this realm where she was saying that there are no acceptable numbers of deaths from coronavirus. Right. And the reason I say that this is like superhero talk is that it's the kind of impractical, dangerous talk that you get on a superhero movie or TV series or something. It always works out in those because they're not real. So what will happen is you'll have some sort of league of superheroes and one of their number gets captured during some mission which is going to save the planet. Okay. And then one of them will say, we never leave anybody behind. We have to go back for them. And somebody else will say, but if this goes wrong, millions of people, billions of people will die. Right. Surely that should be our priority. And then it's like, no, we never leave anybody behind. So they go back to get blowtorch face man or whoever it is, right? They go back to get them. And of course it all works out. They rescue blowtorch face man and blowtorch face man survives and they manage to save the planet. Of course, the reality isn't like that. Reality is you go back and save blowtorch face man, fuck it up, and billions of people die, right? And that's the difference between reality and a superhero movie, is that reality is about making those tough decisions where there is no answer that's entirely satisfactory, where there's a kind of loss in either way. They're difficult decisions. If it isn't a difficult decision, it isn't really a fucking decision. In a superhero world, there aren't difficult decisions generally, because it all works out, doesn't it? So really it doesn't. Just do what seems the most uplifting thing and it'll all work. Everybody will be saved and it'll be great. That's generally the way it pans out. But real world isn't like that. And it kind of gives a false impression. And this is why I felt that Nicola Sturgeon was giving a kind of superhero talk, that because we just don't run anything like that, do we? Cars, one death on the roads is too many, right? So what does that mean? You take all the cars off the road. One death from flu would be too many. I assume if one death from coronavirus is not acceptable, then one death from influenza. So how do we go about that? What do we do? Do we have these procedures in every winter to make sure that not one person dies of that? It's just meaningless talk. Of course, we will do whatever we reasonably can, but there's a trade-off to be made. And there'll be a trade-off to be made here, right? Because all these measures will cost lives. I'll maybe talk about that a little bit later in the video. And so we need to be practical in terms of how this is impacting on people's lives. How it's impacting on the lives of somebody like my mother who's 80 years old, for example. And now, I spoke to her yesterday. I went round and dug a plant out of her front garden, and then after we'd done that, she made me a coffee, and I sat at one end of her back garden, and she sat at the other end. And we had a chat for 10 minutes, maintaining about a 10-metre distance before I went. And that'll be I won't see her now for a week or two, and she won't see another person. I ring her on the phone, other people rings her on the phone. But she's 80 years old, for crying out loud. And like she said to me, now we're talking about the fact that this social distancing for people of her age may be continuous well into next year. She said to me, the problem is that my life isn't going to go on forever, right? That might be the last year that I have. And there is a trade-off to be made. That's one of the trade-offs, isn't there? There was a 105 or something year-old guy, 110-year-old guy who was on the news a few weeks back. It was his birthday. and he was celebrating his birthday social distancing. And I sort of thought, well, I kind of get that. But at the end of the day, there's a very, very high chance this is his last birthday ever. And it's kind of grim to think that his last birthday and his last months are going to be spent isolated to save him from catching something which might kill him. And the penalty of that is he may spend the last year of his life in solitary confinement. I don't know. Like I say, there are trade-offs to be made for all of this. And that kind of talk, I don't think... The kind of talk that Sturgeon gave there, that doesn't really sum that up. There has to be, actually, there always is a trade-off. There's always a trade-off with deaths and suffering and everything else. That's just the way it is. Otherwise, we'd be paralysed. We would never do anything at any point ever, because there's always a downside to everything. And truly, if what she believes is that one coronavirus death is too many, then the things that we have in place now cannot be relaxed at all, at any point, until there is a vaccine. And if you were to put that to her, I'm sure she'd say, oh no, we can't do that. So it's just tripe, it's just blather, it's just superhero talk that isn't practical. And I'd rather have politicians be more pragmatic. The rest of what she said was pragmatic, and then that was just sound bites, you know. So I didn't really like that part of it. The other things that I wanted to talk about were the endless demands for an exit strategy. This is something that Keir Starmer has kept talking about, wanting to know the government's exit strategy. I like Keir Starmer, by the way. I'm pleased he's been elected leader of the Labour Party. And of course, it's the kind of thing opposition politicians do. If the situation was reversed and Boris Johnson was the leader of the opposition, he'd be saying the same thing, wouldn't he? You know, you've got to be broadly supportive. If you as an opposition under these kind of times, people don't like it. But at the same time, you can't just stand there going, yeah, the government's doing everything great, because people don't like that either. And one of the things inevitably is opposition leaders demand to know what you're going to be doing next. And I always find these things somewhat counterproductive, because you know what happens. This happens all the time with politicians. And it's always, or almost always, to our detriment that we do this. The papers do it, opposition parties do it. You see it on the television. They'll get a politician and they'll say, yes, but what are you going to do if this happens? And what are you going to do if this happens? And you often know that that's the last thing you really, really want the politician to have to do, to nail their flag to the mast with that. Because once they've done it, they can't walk it back. And often it's not possible to make those decisions now. You start detailing an exit strategy now, when you really don't know quite how that's going to be. You want the chance, for example, there are some countries that are further on than the UK, so you want to see what they're doing and how that works, and pick the best of those countries that are a little bit more advanced, for example. You want to be fluid with your timescales. You want the chance to be able to put your toes in the water with something and then pull it back. What you don't want to do is to have to outline something, knowing full well that however many times as you do it, you say this is subject to change, blah, 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 you will be accused of walking it back and incompetence and changing your mind and all these different things, right? If you don't then follow it to the letter. Well, you said that you're anticipating that within 3 weeks that you'd be opening schools and you'd be doing this, and then in 6 weeks you'd do this. Why hasn't that happened? Do you accept that you were wrong, that you got it wrong, that you didn't understand, right? And it's so terrible. And because of that, what happens is then politicians end up following through on things when they know they are wrong. That's what they predict will happen. And then when it doesn't come out like that, what they'd rather do is go, okay, yeah, so let's do this instead. But if we do that instead, we're going to get a load of shit for it because we said we're going to do that. So we're just going to push on with this. And we do that to ourselves. That's a self-inflicted wound we make every time we treat politicians like that. It would be a lot better if we lived in a world where we could ask politicians what their exit strategies were, or what their policies were, or what the responses to this would be. If we would then be sensible and reasonable about it, if they didn't enact it, and they said, well, yes, the reason we haven't enacted it is because these predictions were wrong, or this was wrong, or but we don't. We just use it as a as something to beat them with, a stick to beat them with, really. And that's the problem with that. So I really dislike that. I really wish this is one of those circumstances that we allowed a little bit more leeway. We either trust the government's sort of handling or we don't. And if we trust them and roughly the strategy they're going in, allow them to develop a strategy as it goes along. I'm sure they're not just sat on their asses drinking coffee and smoking fat cigars. I'm sure they are all thinking. They've set up all these fucking groups, right? I'm sure they are working out the options as they move forwards. Do we really need them to nail the flags to the masts on that? What I wanted to talk about, and this is something that's been a common thread throughout all of this, and I think what brought it to a head was something my wife said earlier on, and we got into a discussion, and it was clear that she was quite affected by all of this, quite worried by it all. And it occurred to me that what was the more worrying aspect of all of this? What was causing that kind of consternation, that uneasy feeling? That something's terribly wrong. It wasn't the coronavirus itself, but it was all the social steps that are taking place, all the change. I mean, some of the things, if you've ever seen sort of zombie apocalypse films, and at the start of a zombie apocalypse film, they always have a sort of thing which they condense the timescale in, where they show you society going wrong. And there's little government announcements on the news, stay in your homes, do this, and little signs on shops, watch out for people staggering around like so, all these different bits. And actually, there's echoes of that in what's happening here, isn't there? You go to a shop and there are signs plastered on the wall. Only 2 people in the shop at once. Stay 2 meters apart. Don't talk to anybody else. Don't talk to the staff behind the till. Don't, wait till they've put the shopping and then they've scanned it through the till and retreated, and then you can get the shopping. And all this kind of stuff. There are these government announcements. Stay in your homes. Everything will be fine. And it's very, very disconcerting. People's ways of life are changing. Your children can't go to school. You can't see your relatives. In the most tragic of cases, people are dying in hospital, on ventilators, or not on ventilators, but struggling for every breath, because the ventilator, at least they're not conscious. But and they can't see their relatives, they can't even see their relatives as they're dying. Horrible situations. And a lot of these situations are really disrupting our lives. And it's very, very, very unsettling, I think. There's nothing wrong in saying that you feel unsettled by that. You can be quite a hard person and be quite unsettled by that, because it isn't normal. Society is not running in a normal way. And quite honestly, the coronavirus itself could be like it isn't a benign strain of influenza. It isn't a strain of influenza, and it is more deadly. But it could be a benign strain of influenza, and if the government imposed the same restrictions and there was the same fanfare made about it, we'd still feel just as uneasy. Because I think a lot of that ease doesn't come from the actual bare stats of what our chances of dying if we catch it, etc., are. It comes from all the changes that have taken place. And I think it's a very, very difficult situation with regard to that, because as a government, how do you handle that? You have to put these things in place, and you have to put a little bit of the fear of God into people, otherwise they won't take them seriously. But there's a sort of 2 lines on the curve here. The more you do that, the more you start to instill the negative aspects of that fear, which you don't want. You want people to take things seriously, but in a sober sort of way of thinking about it. But actually people don't respond to that, especially not when there's disruption, significant disruption to their lives. You get this sort of negative aspect to it as well. I think this terrible feeling of unease that something's terribly wrong, and where is it going to end? One thing that I've heard a lot of talk about is like, where is this going to go afterwards? And will things return to normal? And I've heard people say things will never be normal again. That kind of reminds me of how I feel when I've drunk too much and I've puked until there's just nothing left, right? and I've had a cracking headache, I'm puking my guts up, and I thought, I'm never going to drink again. I'm never going to do it. It's never going to happen. There is no way I'm going to put myself through it again. And within a day, we have a marvellous capacity to just forget all about that, right? And within a day, especially when I was younger, I'd kind of forgotten all of that, and I was quite happy to just inflict that upon myself again. And I think that society actually will be a little bit more like that. I think this is a momentous time in our life. We will remember this. This will be a standout thing. This is something we're going to talk about. Well, we're going to live with the financial implications of it for probably a couple of decades, I would think. It's going to be huge. The amount of national debt that we're going to take on is going to be phenomenal in country after country after country. Mind-blowing, shattering levels of debt. So there's going to be that. But I just think the whole experience we're going to be talking about. I said before, not the last video, the video back, that I hope that part of the good out of it is that we're better able to deal with things like this in the future. That we set up things which might seem expensive, but in terms of the cost that this has been, they're absolutely infinitesimal. They're trivial. We set up things so that next time we can really hit the ground running. They were talking about, like, if this had happened 20 years ago, the idea of having a vaccine in a year's time would just have blown us away. That it would have been like years and years and years and years and years time. How would we have dealt with it then? Well, we wouldn't. We'd just have had to let it run wild, I suppose. But if the way the timescales are altering now, it's not inconceivable to think that within another decade we'd be able to bang out a vaccine in a few months. There's always going to be a certain time frame because you've got to test things, but we'll be able to shorten that time scale down, if needs be, down a whole lot more. And hopefully we'll maintain a lot of mothball ventilators and different things, and we'll be able to study how these things have spread around the world. We've got a proper real life case, never mind making simulations and looking at things like SARS and stuff like that never properly spread in this kind of a way to this degree. Now we have an actual case study to go at, and hopefully we'll learn quite a bit from that. But in terms of an end game to all of this, it's kind of interesting to wonder where we go next, both in the short term and long term, and how things will pan out in the long term. And looking back on this, where we'll be at. I think in the short term, when I read that report out 5 weeks ago, they were talking about a sort of cyclical strategy whereupon you impose some measures and clamp down on it, which is the phase that the UK is in now. Some countries are just pulling out of that, and then maybe you can't maintain that, so you release it for a couple of months and then you put those measures down again. It seems like the more they're thinking about it, and again this is looking at the not nailing the flags to the mast, forcing politicians to state exactly what they're going to do. It looks like they're getting to an approach now where they're considering a more strategic thing where you're looking at that sort of reproduction factor. I can't think if that's what it's called, where it's sort of how many you pass it on to. They want you to pass it on to. It needs to be less than one. Everybody who has it passes it on to less than one person, not more than one person. That they may look at sort of strategically just releasing some of those things, like allowing the youngest children to go back to school because it's really important for their socialisation, but pubs and restaurants will stay closed maybe till next year. They'll relax some of them and not others, and maybe try and maintain a sort of continuum, an equilibrium, reach a sort of balancing point where rather than releasing everything and then putting it back in again, you reach a point where we're maintaining some things all the time, letting some things go all the time, and it just keeps that level. You push that level right down and then maintain it at the sort of 1 or just below the 1 figure. I don't know. It seems like they may be pushing more towards that now. But it's interesting, and again, as I say, I think you're going to see, as many countries as there are, you're going to see variations of approach. And if you're one of the later countries on that curve, then sit back and see how those other things work. Put things in place, have ideas, get ready for these things, but don't nail your flag to the mast too early on that, because you might find that there's a good idea of doing it one way that works better than another way. But how this is going to pan out in the real longer term, I don't know. And it gets into a sort of philosophical question that I suppose people have grappled, which is that you can look at sort of the absolute deaths for things. And then you can look at the deaths that are directly attributable to things. And they don't scale in importance on a one-to-one factor, it doesn't seem, when people make decisions. People are much more concerned with deaths that are directly attributable to things than deaths that result from things but are in a more amorphous capacity. So, for example, if I'm a politician and you tell me to make a decision, and this decision will save these 10 named people from dying, but if I do it over the course of the next 5 years, 100 unnamed random people within society will die as a result, I'm going to save those 10 lives. Because those are 10 lives that you can pin on me. If I don't do that, you will pin those 10 deaths on me. Whereas those 100 amorphous deaths, you know there's been 100 deaths, but you can't pinpoint exactly which of... All you can see is statistically, as a result of my action, there are now 100 more deaths, but you can't say exactly who it is. And that seems to be how things run. And that seems to be the way that the equation is being formed here. There is an acceptance that this will lead to deaths from other things. The measures that we're putting in place will lead to deaths. We know the numbers of deaths that resulted, it's estimated over 100,000 from the result of the 2008 recession and the measures that were put in place there. Some people say, well, those measures didn't need to be put into place. We could have handled it differently. I think our options are going to be more limited here because the levels of debt are going to be so astronomically high. National debt are going to be so astronomically high. There are going to be things that we will have to do as a result, cutbacks that have to be made, because you've got to service that astronomical national debt. And as a result of that, it doesn't take much of a reduction in services for thousands of deaths every year to result from that. You only have to result mental health care back a little bit. You only have to knock fire cover back a little bit, the police back a little bit, other aspects of the NHS back a little bit, all these different things back a little bit, social care back a little bit, and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of deaths can result. I'm not confident to say that we won't look back in 10 years' time, 15 years' time, and try and cost the lives that we've saved as a result of the measures that we're putting in place, and the lives that are lost as a result of those measures, and the cost of the economic cost, and the impact that then has back on society, and say that actually the measures that we've put into place have cost several times more lives than we could conceivably say that we've saved. Does that mean, this is the tough thing, does that mean we shouldn't be doing what we're doing now? Again, it boils down to the fact that you can put a label explicitly on almost every single person who has died as a result of this. Some of them were maybe in the last year or two of living anyway. They're seriously, gravely ill, but it doesn't matter. It's still, you can still put a label on it and say that person's died because of coronavirus. And it's very difficult to get away from that, especially if you're a politician, because you're going to be held accountable for that. Whereas you're not going to be, once you've done the right thing, and you've acted and you've saved those lives, if hundreds of thousands of people die in the next decade as a result of that, well, that's a tragedy, but it's a tragedy that resulted from you doing the right thing. And I think people find that palatable. They don't simply balance up the numbers of lives lost from different strategies. So I don't know, it's interesting. This is going to be something that's going to be interesting to see what happens in the next few months. But then as we manage to kick over the embers of it, which is, like I say, it's going to be 10 years time at least, because you've got to see what the economic impacts are in the longer term. And this is kind of totally unprecedented, this kind of thing. And it's not just one country. It's like all these developed countries are having to, it's costing them all these huge amounts of money. I don't know, interesting to see where that goes. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to talk about, I'm just staring at my screen, I'm just thinking, shit, I hope this was recording. I did say that some people might just be interested to know sort of how it's impacted on me and my life. And it's interesting. It's thrown me into a certain amount of turmoil. I've had that sense of unease. I think that's quite natural. My working life has changed. I work at a fire station, and in the town that I work, there were 2 fire stations. And one of the fire stations, effectively in terms of an operational fire station, that means there's a fire engine in there with a fire crew, as opposed to just office staff doing those kind of related tasks. It was mothballed a few years ago, just used as office staff. And now I've been sort of seconded with a group of a few others to that station to try and split the watch up I'm on, so that if somebody on the watch gets the coronavirus symptoms, it doesn't take everybody down. We're splitting us up, so that effectively you don't lose 3 fire engines in one go. You're splitting up with 2 at one and 1 at another, and keeping those people separate. So that's been kind of interesting. That's a fire station that just doesn't have all the facilities that a fire station would normally have, the PE equipment, the PT equipment, the cooking facilities and all those kinds of things. So we've sort of had to try and get that up and running and make it a place that will function as a fire station that you can spend, we do 24-hour shifts, 24 hours at a time on. So that's been an interesting aspect with regards to that, and working lots and lots of different ways of working to try and protect ourselves, to try and protect some of the things that we would do with our communities, to try and protect those communities, to visit old people, to check that they're safe in their homes. We're having to, again, it's one of these kind of balancing, juggling acts, isn't it? We're having to not do those, to shelve those in many cases, because the risk of transferring an infection to somebody who's in their 80s and 90s who's frail is greater maybe as an immediate risk than the risk of a house fire, which is actually technically quite a small risk of any one individual having a house fire like that. So we're having to work and only go in those situations in the most pressing of circumstances for that. So lots of things with regard to my work. My wife's not working because she's a teacher and the schools are closed. My son is at home all the time. I'm trying to teach him some maths. My wife's trying to teach him his English, his reading and writing, etc., etc. I think that's going pretty well, actually. I'm thinking his maths is maybe progressing quicker than it would be anyway. I'm looking at where he's supposed to be at the end of what is his foundation year, and it looks like he's going to be way beyond that. And I'm just going to keep pushing that, I think. And yet we're doing less hours schooling with him. And it's made me think about homeschooling, and I'd always thought what an onerous thing homeschooling would be, because I'm thinking if you had to spend, I'd probably shoot myself if I had to spend all day every day tutoring my son, let alone if I had 3 or 4 kids. And yet one thing that I've realised as a result of that is that you could actually do it in a much more efficient way. Because it's one-on-one, because you're working to their level, because you can mix it in with everything else, that you can actually, some of it you can do in a much more efficient fashion, certainly at the younger age, that maybe where he'll sit in school all day, but it'll just be a set of tasks that'll work for everybody, and he'll do his little bit. Now you can just focus on him, half an hour, right, we're going to do some adding, we're going to do some multiplication, and you'll do it for half an hour, and it's a bit of a blast, and he'll work some of it out. Some of it's still a bit of a mystery to him, but after half an hour it's all been focused on him, and there's been some sound progress there. And so maybe homeschooling actually isn't quite as onerous as I would have thought it would be. But in terms of his socialisation, I think it's terrible. He doesn't have any brothers or sisters, so he's just not getting to play with other children. And this is going to drag on, it's a sort of month now, it could be another couple of months or whatever, and he's not getting to play with other children in school or out of school. And I think that's more of a concern, than anything else. I'm fortunate because I don't live on my own. I have a wife. I have a child. I have a garden. I can go out there, I can cut the grass, I can trim the hedge. I haven't done that yet. I've got a garage with stuff in it. I've got a front driveway. I brewed some beer the other day, 3 days ago, another stab at an American IPA. This will be my 3rd stab. Hopefully I'll get it right this time. The first 2 have been qualified failures, I would say. They've both produced nice beers, lovely drinkable beers, but not with the level of hop aroma and hop taste that I was hoping for. They've not really been quite the beer that I was trying to create, albeit they've come out nice. So hopefully this time I've got the hopping levels and the hopping techniques right and it'll work out. But I've got a chance to do things like that. So from my perspective, and I'm an antisocial twat anyway, so from my perspective I can kind of live with this maybe better than some people can. I'm not that bothered if I don't have to go out socialising down the gym or this or that every day. I'm quite happy to go out on my bike on my own. I'm quite happy to sit with my own thoughts some of the time. And like I say, I've got a wife and a child at home, so I'm okay. Really, with regard to that. So if anybody's sort of wondering how my life's going, but it has made making videos, it's disrupted all of this. So that's why this will be the only video that I make this month. Next month, I'm hoping to get back. Right, this has become, it's a terrible phrase because I just keep hearing it all the time. It's a good phrase, but you get irritated when you keep hearing them. This has become a bit of a new normal for me now. So it's what I said actually in a video. I said that at first this will seem really disruptive, but just hang in there because you'll get used to it and you'll get into a swing and a bit of a pattern with it, and then it won't seem so bad and it will become a new normal. I mentioned that in an earlier video before everybody started saying new normal every 5 minutes. And it is true, and that is what has happened to me. Same as it's happened to everybody else, and that feeling of unease starts to go as you realise actually the sky hasn't fallen in, and there's still television to watch, and there's the world's still spinning. So I'm kind of at that, and in terms of making videos, that's probably a good thing because I'll get back more into the swing of that next month. Oh, my son has learnt to ride his bike. That's another thing. And catch. We've been out in the garden practicing catching. He's catching now from not getting within a million miles of the ball and not keeping his crocodiling. He's cupping his hands. He's following the ball. He's watching the ball. How many times I had to say to him, watch the ball. Don't look at me. Watch the ball. And I'll throw the ball at him and I'm like, you're still watching me. You're not watching the ball. Oh, watch the ball, Daddy. Throw the ball at him. You're still looking at my eyes. And I'm like, I thought this is never going to end. But now he follows the ball all the way. He drops more than he catches, but he's doing the right things. He has gone in 5 or 6 weeks from not wanting to ride his bike, the bike that he had, because he just couldn't do it. He could sort of go in a straight line for 10 or 15 metres, wobbling, and that was about all he could do. And now he's got his bike. We've ordered him a new bike. His new bike arrived a few days ago, a bigger bike with gears, and he's learnt to ride his smaller bike. He can corner, he can do everything. He's brilliant. He's gone from there to this new bike. He understands the gears, he understands the methodology and the reasoning, the rationale behind the gears, and that he needs to be in a lower gear to going up the hill, etc., etc. And he's using them. And he's gone out for a couple of rides with his mum and I. She goes in front, I'm behind, he's in the middle, on his bike, on the roads. We've gone out, maybe done 1.5 miles with him. So absolutely fantastic. So pleased, so proud of him for that. He's made immense progress with regard to that. Now he wants to go out, from not wanting to go out on his bike, from having to threaten him. You won't get to play on your tablet or watch the television unless you have another try on your bike, to now, and I want to go on my bike, Daddy. I want to go on my bike again, Daddy. I want another go on my bike. So that's absolutely fantastic. So I suppose some of those things have been positive. So I'm doing okay. I am genuinely interested to know, if you're a regular viewer of this channel, how you are doing. So if you've got this far, you must be desperate. You must be desperate in your coronavirus lockdown. But if you have, by all means, leave a comment discussing anything I've talked about. But also interested to know just how you are getting on. How is it impacting on you? Are you on your own, or have you got a family with you? Are you maybe enjoying some aspects of it, perverse as it may sound, because the roads are free and clear, there isn't as much traffic around, you're getting more time to yourself, perhaps. I'm just interested to know, because I think it's so interesting how not unique people's experiences are, but just how diverse they are. Some people, this is a nightmare to them, and other people actually totally got their heads around it, chilled by it, and actually enjoying some aspects of the changes of their way of life. Okay, that's it. I hope you've got something out of this. Like I say, it was never intended to be a super structured kind of run through or anything like I'd normally do. But I just wanted to touch base and discuss some of the things that had interested me, that are maybe not the things that are normally discussed or the ways in which they're normally discussed. Okay, as ever, thank you for watching. Bye for now.